Hi there. My name is Professor Thomas Trimble. I teach technical writing at Wayne State University, and this presentation is on the topic of visual design, specifically with the design of PowerPoint slides or presentation slides. Here's a short preview of the presentation. Number one, I'm going to just talk about some important design principles that we use when we talk about the design of presentation slides. And then I'm going to go through some specific strategies and examples of the design principles I introduce here. I should say at the beginning, there's many different ways of thinking about how to design PowerPoint slides. So even the terms I use in this presentation, you might find familiar, or they might be new to you, or you might have come across other discussions or articles or readings, videos about presentation design that uses different language. Sometimes we just use different words for the same principle or strategy. So anyway, this is just kind of how I think about it and how we'll read about it over the course of the semester in the text that we use in our course. The big idea here is that slide design and slide layout, the way that our slides look, impacts clarity and manages attention. I would argue that these two things are the most important criteria for effective presentations. Getting our message across, clarity, and managing the attention, keeping the attention of our audience. Here are the principles I'm going to be talking about in this presentation. Number one is simplicity, keeping things simple. Number two is color contrast. Number three is reading order. Number four is size, and number five is alignment. So these are the principles I'll be talking about, and then again, we're going to talk about some strategies and look at some examples in the rest of the presentation. And again, you may have come across other learning aids where we've used different words or different words have been used for these principles, but you'll find a lot of overlap when we talk about presentation design. I should also say at this point that, at this point, you've probably seen lots of different kinds of PowerPoint presentations, good presentations, bad presentations. Different organizations, different companies have very different styles for the way that they lay out and the way they approach slides. So what I'm sort of trying to make an argument for is what I think are some important principles that we can use across different cultures. So when you go into the workplace or when you start an internship in an organization, you may find that they do things differently than I talk about here. And so you need to be flexible and ready to adapt. But I still think it's a good idea to keep these principles in mind as you learn how to be an effective presenter. So first of all, let's talk about simplicity. And when we talk about simplicity, we're really talking about avoiding clutter. We're talking about keeping slides simple. Two main strategies here, or two important strategies here. Number one, to minimize the number of elements on the slide. We don't want more than 3 or 4 elements on a slide. And by elements, we mean text blocks, images, captions. We'll take a look at an example in a minute. We're just trying to keep things simple. We also want to sort of manage the amount of white space or blank space on a slide to achieve visual clarity and balance, again, so that we facilitate the clarity of the message of a slide, and we also manage the audience's attention and we don't overwhelm the audience with too much information or confusing information. So here's an example of a very cluttered slide. If we count the number of elements here, including the heading, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's maybe, depending on how you're counting, there's at least 7 different elements here. This is very confusing. We get a combination of text, graphs, images, icons, clip art. We could probably dig into this and try and figure out what the main message of this slide is, but this is too many elements. It does not facilitate a clear message, and it does not do a good job of focusing the audience's attention. So how could we make this better? So here's a revision of this slide. I've reduced it to, depending on your counting things, 3 elements. There's a heading or title in the top left-hand corner, wage stagnation. Then there's a line graph in the middle of the slide that contains its own title and subtitle, the graph itself, and then a source in the lower right-hand corner. Where did this information come from? So again, depending on how you're counting, I've gone from 7 elements or so in the previous slide to 3 elements here in this slide. I argue that this slide its message is much clearer. The topic, we're focusing on wage stagnation, and also managing the attention, telling you where to look and what to see. So again, just by decluttering, reducing the number of elements and focusing on the most important information, I think this is a better slide. Maybe you disagree with me, but I think this is better. We also want to talk about managing blank or white space. If you take a look at this slide, you see a lot of blank space. You see a heading in the upper left-hand corner, and then you see a dotted list along that left-hand margin. This slide is pretty simple, but I would argue that the excess of blank space does not do a great job of keeping the audience's attention. I think I understand the purpose of this slide or the content of this slide, but we need to think a little about, we want to keep people's attention. It's not that your slide has to be exciting. Very few workplace slides are exciting, but we need to keep the audience's attention the best we can. So how might we improve this? So notice that I've added an element here. I've added a photograph of apples, but I've also changed the layout of the slide so that the slide elements are more evenly distributed across the entire slide. So I still have the heading in the upper left-hand corner. I still have a dotted list there along that left margin, but I've increased the amount of space in between the items, the variety of apples, to make them a little bit easier to read and to make better use of the available space here on the slide. And then I've changed or included an image of apples, which I probably could have even made a little bit bigger. But I don't want this image to dominate the slide. I want it to complement the other text elements of the slide. So I include those as well. So you see, I'm just using the white space a little bit more in a more balanced way. And again, I think that does improve the clarity of the slide, but it also just helps keep the audience's attention. And certainly the inclusion of a graphic element, in this case a photograph of apples, helps to do that as well. When we talk about slide design or slide layout, we also want to talk a little bit about color contrast. Color contrast refers to the difference between an element like text and the background. So you'll see here that there are 2 colors, or 3 colors, I guess, on the slide. There is black text against white background. That's what we call a high contrast combination. And then you see the text in light gray that is a little bit more difficult to see against the white background. That is a low contrast combination, the light gray against the white. In general, we want to use high contrast combinations like black on white or white on black, or we can also talk about colors and using colors in a way that has high contrast. We'll talk a little bit more about color when we talk about designing accessible slides and accessibility. What the main point here is, we want our slide elements, whether those are graphic elements or whether those are text elements like here, that there's a high amount of contrast, there's clear contrast between the foreground elements, the text, and the background, in this case, the white background. So we'll talk more about contrast in a little bit. When we talk about layout, we also want to talk about reading order. In English, readers decode and encounter text moving left to right in a Z pattern. So if we just use the alphabet, if you take a look at this slide, you'll naturally want to read in that left to right and in a Z pattern. A to B, then across the slide and down to C, and then over to D. Now, I just used the letters of the alphabet here as an illustration. We could also imagine in place of A, B, C, D, I might have images or different elements there. But for readers in English, people who are reading English, that pattern is going to stay the same regardless of what elements are in these spots. Starting from the left over to the right, and then down, and then over to the right, so in that Z shape. So whenever we're designing a slide, we want to keep that reading order in mind when we decide where elements are going. So just as an example, let's take a look at this slide. If I now move things around and you think about reading left to right in that Z shape, trying to decode this now becomes a bit challenging because you're expecting the layout to go A, B, C, D. So we change this around, we go C, A, B, D. The meaning of the slide is a little bit more challenging. That presents a little bit more of a challenge to our brain. So again, imagine that we're not using letters of the alphabet, but we're using images or we're using a sequence of numbers. Again, a reader is going to expect that sort of left to right Z shape, and we need to think about that and keep that in mind when we're designing slides. Size is also really important when we talk about slide design. As a sort of general rule, we want to avoid text smaller than 28 point. We also want to use size to communicate relationships. So take a look at the bottom line of this slide. I have 3 text items: New York, Chicago, and Detroit. So these are names of 3 big cities. Now we could think about the difference in size a couple different ways. One, New York is the largest in terms of population city of these 3, so it makes some sense that it's bigger than Chicago and Detroit. So that's maybe the first thing that comes to mind. You might also ask yourself, well, which of these 3 cities are the biggest geographically? Actually don't know the answer to that question, but if you were to look at this line, you might think that New York is the largest of the 3 geographically. The point here is that we can use size to communicate relationships between items. You don't have to, but it's just another tool in your design toolbox when you're designing a slide and when you're trying to create a message for your audience. Another principle that we want to talk about is alignment. And by alignment, we mean the way that things line up. And we could talk about the way that things line up on a slide vertically. We could also talk about the way that things line up horizontally. So we can use alignment to communicate relationships. So take a look at my dotted list here. I've got basically a 2-item dotted list with 2 items under each one. So I have 2 different kinds of fruit, apples and pears, and under each one of those, a type of each one of those. So Fuji and Gala are different types of apples. Bartlett and Renanju are different types of pears. Now, notice though the sublisting on each of those. I have tabbed in from that left margin where apples is for the list Fuji and Gala. They're tabbed in. So what that communicates to the reader, this nesting of these items using alignment communicates that these are types of apples. The same thing with the pears. So it's a very, very simple strategy. But by tabbing those in, by changing the alignment of those items, we're communicating a relationship. These are types of something, right? Now I'm going to exit out of slideshow mode for a moment here so that we'll go into working mode in PowerPoint. PowerPoint has grid lines that are part of its design. So you see here I can click around and look at the different text element, the different elements here. But I'm going to grab this text box and I'm going to start moving it, and you'll see the dotted lines appear in PowerPoint that help with the alignment. So once you see that vertical align, you know that this text box is now centered. If I move it down and you see that then that cross hatching across the middle, now you know that this text box is centered. Now I've got a heading for this dotted list, so I'm actually going to move this down, but I still want this text box to be centered on the page, and I'm going to use that guideline to do that. I can also use those grid lines to make sure that my other slide headings and slide elements are aligned. So for instance, I can look at where my alignment, my title goes, and I just, to sort of facilitate clarity and balance here, I want to make sure that this text box is also aligned. And I could also think about using alignment in that grid tool to make sure that my text box is also aligned, or I might design that, and for sake of clarity, I actually want to bring this in a little bit. But I still like the idea of it being. So again, there's no rules here necessarily. The idea here is that we can use alignment to communicate relationships, to facilitate clarity on the slide, and that PowerPoint allows us to use these grid lines to help manage that. Okay, I'm going to go back into slideshow mode here, and we'll go on to the next slide. So that's it for visual design. There are other concepts that are more either techniques that we can use to facilitate these, or different strategies that we can use. We'll introduce some additional concepts when we start talking about slide accessibility. So there are 5 design principles that I introduced in this presentation: simplicity, color contrast, reading order, size, and alignment. And again, why do we care about these things? Why are these things important? My argument to you is that these 5 principles help facilitate clarity, help us get our message across, and they also manage attention for your audiences. Okay? This presentation on visual design is meant to go along with the next presentation on text design. If you have any questions at all, let me know. You can email me at ttrimble@wayne.edu. Thanks for listening.